Hello again. Welcome to part 2 of the video, the proposed return of grammar schools. It would seem that England's problem is not about whether it should have a selective education system or not. The problem is that the quality of education in too many of our schools is absolutely woeful. More especially in the north of the country, which is losing out yet again. If you live in the north of England, the statistics which I'm going to read out are sort of paraphrased from Ofsted, the annual Ofsted report of 2015. They're absolutely shocking. I'll just read it now. After the age of 11, if you draw a line across the country to divide England's secondary schools into roughly half, that's 79% of secondary schools in the south of England are good or outstanding, compared with only 68% of schools in the North and Midlands. And of course, there are some excellent schools in the North and Midlands that are achieving outstanding results in challenging circumstances. And there are also areas in the south which are not well served by local secondary schools. However, overall, 410,000 children in the North and Midlands attend a secondary school that's less than good. If schools in these regions were performing as well as those in the south, 160,000 more children would attend good schools. I mean, that's a terrible, terrible indictment of what's happening. There are 1,666 secondary schools in the North and Midlands and 1,716 secondary schools in the south. The lower standards in secondary schools in the North and Midlands have a direct impact on outcomes for children and young people. Compared with children and young people in the rest of the country, those living in the North and Midlands, they make between 4 and 6 percentage points less progress from ages 11 to 16 in maths and English, and 5 points less in achievement of 5 GCSE grades at A star to C, including maths and English. That's dreadful. As recent studies from the Organisation for Economic Cooperation and Development, that's OEDC, they're the people who run the PISA examination, have shown individuals with high educational attainment, they generally have better health, they're more socially engaged, they have higher employment rates, and they have higher relative earnings, obviously, as a result of that. And then they go on to say, we will fail these children and their communities if we do not equip them to share in the prosperity a well-educated population creates. The divide in the quality of secondary school standards across England is not simply a product of greater numbers of disadvantaged pupils in the North and Midlands. If you just look at the figures for young people who are not disadvantaged, there is still a 4 percentage point gap between the North and Midlands and the South in terms of attainment of 5 good GCSE grades, including English and maths. And then a very important statement they make here. It is, however, the case that where schools are not good enough, the disadvantaged suffer the most. When you compare outcomes for young people eligible for free school meals across England, those in the North and Midlands are 6 percentage points behind pupils eligible for free school meals in the South, who achieve 5 GCSEs in those higher grades, again including maths and English. And they are 6 percentage points behind pupils eligible for free school meals who go on to university in the South. Now, this difference is largely driven by the remarkable success of secondary schools in London, the region with the highest levels of disadvantage in the country, but the best performing secondary schools. Areas in London like Haringey, Islington and Lambeth now have nothing but good and outstanding secondary schools. I mean, some say that this is a sort of London is an exception and that it's not really a fair comparison. But if it's just about income, just about wealth, why is there so little difference in primary schools? If you divide the country's primary schools into half, 85% of primary schools in the South are good and outstanding, compared with 84% in the North and Midlands. What happens when these children move to secondary education? Why, during those 4 years between 11 and 16, does this disparity develop? And the imposition of grammar schools by a Conservative government, it will do absolutely nothing whatsoever to improve the situation for the majority of pupils. And all it will do, it will just inflame the passions which were aroused in the north of England by the European referendum, which of course resulted in Brexit, much to the astonishment of those in the south. People in the north, for the most part, do not want grammar schools. What they want is that the schools they've already got do a good job, which at the moment most of them, it would seem, are not. I mean, have the people in the south of England, I mean, have they learned nothing from Brexit? Anyway, to return to the North Riding school I mentioned earlier. It changed to a comprehensive school in 1970, and for years it delivered the most amazing exam results. I mean, how did it do that? What was it about this school that enabled it to do that? Well, the children were streamed according to ability, and there were sort of broad bands. It wasn't A, B, C, D, E, F, G. The pupils were streamed according to their ability. There was a broad band of 3 or 4 parallel top sets. I mean, that was more than had ever passed 11 plus. And each set had about 30 pupils in it, in the major subjects. A sort of a grammar school broadband stream, if you like. And this broadband of pupils, they delivered examination successes grammar schools could only have dreamed about. The Middlesets also achieved success way beyond anything achieved by secondary moderns. And because of its size, it was able to offer a much broader curriculum than any grammar school could offer. And the least able children, they could be taught in much smaller sets with specialist teachers. The big advantage, of course, was that late developers, they could move sets at any time. You didn't have to sit some examination and move schools. If halfway through a year you were obviously misplaced, they quite simply bumped you up. Well, a slight downside is that if you were misplaced and you weren't succeeding very well, then you could be moved down also into the middle band. But that happened very, very rarely. The other advantage, of course, was the fate of the 11 plus. That was banished. The anguish in families if one child passed the 11 plus and went to grammar school and the other one failed and had to go to secondary modern, that all disappeared. That must have been the worst nightmare for a family. And seemingly a relatively minor issue to us as adults, but for children. Important friendships from primary schools, they just continued into the comprehensive school. Friendships were not broken up by when one went to the grammar school and one went to the secondary modern, as it happened in the old system. I mean, this was comprehensive education at its very best. And its success was down to the leadership of the headmaster. There was something about him which inspired pupils, inspired teachers, and more importantly, inspired parents. I mean, this importance of good leadership, it just cannot be overemphasised. And again, Ofsted rightly bang on about this throughout their annual report. And as I said, having been through Ofsted inspections, I'm not a big fan. I think they're very much responsible for the droves of teachers who are leaving the profession, but that's another issue. I'll come back to that later. So these are, again, paraphrasing from the Ofsted 2015 annual report. In 2015, Ofsted studied 114 schools that had declines from good or outstanding to requires improvement or inadequate. The main problem common to these schools was poor leadership. And then the difference between good and bad leadership according to Ofsted. Our inspectors have observed that good head teachers have a relentless focus on high standards. They refuse to be distracted from their core purpose of school improvement, and they take decisive steps to ensure that their vision is not compromised by weak teaching or poor leadership and management within the school. They communicate their high expectations of staff and pupils effectively, and they lead by example, modelling the standards of behaviour they want across their school. Typically, these head teachers are not afraid to take a directed approach when first building the leadership capacity of senior and middle leaders within the school. They also ensure that they have robust management systems to hold staff to account for their leadership and teaching and to track pupils' progress. In other words, somebody who was a bit ruthless. And going on, we found that schools that improved their behaviour had worked on the school culture, creating a climate of high expectations. There were a number of examples of head teachers clearly leading by example, creating an atmosphere where pupils can flourish. There were examples where it was clear that it was the relentless energy of the head teacher that had made the difference. The achievement of pupils from low-income backgrounds is one of the ongoing weaknesses in our education system. Compared with many other industrial countries, the UK is notable for the long tail of educational underperformance. The gap between pupils eligible for free school meals and their peers remains very wide at 27 percentage points. We won't worry what the points mean. And is considerably wider in many parts of the country. This year, we carried out 37 monitoring visits to schools with generally good performance, but that were underperforming for the minority of pupils in the school eligible for free school meals. The school was doing all right, except for the bottom end. The overarching conclusion from this work is that tackling disadvantage is a leadership issue. The major weaknesses in the schools that were less effective for disadvantaged pupils was that senior teachers and governors didn't regard the performance of pupils in this group as a school priority. My goodness. So, let's looking at Ripon. In Ripon, the secondary modern is now an academy, and in its recent Ofsted report, that's 2016, this year, they say the outstanding vision and enterprise of the chief executive and drive of the academy leaders have resulted in rapid and sustained improvement and high achievement. So, with good leadership, you can turn a school round, but by tremendous effort. So, it's very apparent from all of this that it's not the system that's failing to deliver, but there's a great shortage of outstanding teachers and head teachers. And this results in great disparity, as supply and demand obviously leads the better into the relatively easy life of the leafy suburbs. And who would blame them? I mean, there are some excellent heads who, with sort of missionary zeal, take on the challenges of failing schools and turn them around. But by come, they're rare birds indeed, they really are. And of course they don't stay very long. They establish their reputation and then they move on to better schools elsewhere with ease. A failing school is in a catch-22 situation. To improve its status, it needs an inspirational headmaster or head teacher and excellent teachers. But because of their reputation, they can't attract these people. In fact, I mean, there are some schools, they can't attract anybody at all. They advertise for teachers and get no response. And so they have to rely on teacher supply agencies. And Ofsted go on about this. I'll just paraphrase this a little bit from Ofsted. 50% of head teachers in relatively affluent areas said they were not able to recruit enough good staff, rising to 77% in the more challenging areas. 74% of head teachers in relatively affluent areas said there was insufficient teacher training provision in the area to ensure a good flow of new entrants into teaching, and this rises to 91% in the most challenging areas. 28% of head teachers in relatively affluent areas had temporary teaching arrangements in place in either maths or science. I mean, it's a third of head teachers in those areas couldn't get good teachers for maths and science. But in more challenging areas, this went up to 61%. The overriding message from these head teachers in schools of all grades and types is that teacher recruitment is a very real problem. In each of the 3 regions surveyed, head teachers reported huge competition for good teachers, with fewer trainees coming through, and I'll talk about that later. Trainees could take their pick of the schools they wanted to work in when they qualified. And again, not surprisingly, most of them opted for well-performing schools in a sought-after area with good transport links. And as ever, it will be the schools in the most challenging and isolated areas that find it hardest to recruit candidates of the right calibre. So, if you introduce grammar schools, new grammar schools, they'll quite simply hoover up the best teachers and head teachers, leaving those schools that need them most in the most challenging circumstances. They'll just be left out in the wilderness. And of course they have 80% or thereabouts of all the children. I mean, I can't believe that that's really what the government and the majority of parents want. I just can't believe it. I mean, Ofsted go on to say that all our evidence shows that it is good leadership, and particularly good leadership of teaching and learning, that makes the biggest difference. That makes the biggest difference to school and college standards. However, it continues to be the case that in many areas of the country there is a shortage of high quality teachers, with secondary schools in the most challenging areas in the North and Midlands often the most acutely affected. Of the 49 secondary schools in the most disadvantaged areas that have inadequate leadership and management, 41 are in the North and Midlands. That's a shocking figure. If the importance of leadership is so widely recognised, why has more not been done to develop good leaders and encouraging them to work in the most challenging of context, in the areas of the country that need them most? That's a very interesting question. We need to grow more good teachers and leaders and find ways to encourage them to work in the schools, colleges and local areas where they are most needed. Without enough good leaders and teachers, effective oversight and governance, and a concerted effort to support the most disadvantaged, we will not bring about the improvements needed. So, they seem to know where the problem is. So where are these inspiring head teachers and teachers to come from? Where are we going to get them from? It's estimated that there's going to be 1 million more pupils in our schools by 2024. So we're going to need more teachers than ever. Recent statistics about teacher recruitment and retainment make for pretty dismal reading. In 2005, 20% of teachers who qualified, they either didn't start teaching at all, or they left teaching within the first year. By 2011, it was 38% of teachers, and rising. Teachers are leaving the profession in droves to work in the private sector, or they go abroad to teach abroad, or they leave the profession altogether. I mean, why is that? And what measures are being taken to address that? In 2016, this year, none of the initial teacher training courses is full. Many are less than half full, including things like design and technology, maths, business studies, and physics, inevitably. And Ofsted make the following comments. Given the importance of the quality of teaching, it is a concern that although we have an increasingly high standard of entrance into the teaching profession, we don't have enough of them, and too many of them are opting not to work in the most challenging areas. Again, who could blame them? Across England, the number of entrants into teachers training has fallen by almost 6,500 since 2009/10. And this year, that's 2015, it was 7% below the number needed. There continue to be shortages in the STEM subjects. These are science, technology, engineering and maths. Again, a bit of jargon. In particular, it's welcome that the number of teachers returning to the profession has increased. However, many newly qualified teachers, in particular, continue to leave to teach abroad, to go into the independent sector, or deciding that teaching is not for them. As the economy improves and job opportunities in financial services and the new manufacturing industries increase, this problem, it can only become worse. I mean, it's a crisis in the making, a really serious crisis. So, just to bring all this to an end, I would argue that comprehensive schools can better meet the needs of all pupils, but too many lack the quality of leadership and backing necessary. Too many local education authorities are failing in their duty. I mean, a sizable number of senior appointments in schools has a political bias to it. Whilst Ofsted has done much to highlight success, and more particularly in this case, failures in schools, the pressures it's brought with it, they're causing this hemorrhaging of teachers, particularly the best, because they can find opportunities elsewhere. I mean, the government must take pressure off teachers to retain them and allow a period of consolidation, so that the recent improvements in education or in schools continues. The government must also do something to increase recruitment, to stem the flow of the best teachers from the profession and provide massive incentives for these teachers to take up the challenges of underachieving schools. I mean, the only way to do that is financial. You've just got to pay them the money, bite the bullet. I seem to remember in New Zealand years ago, they had a two-tier pay scale. An upper pay scale and a lower pay scale. And you could only get onto the upper pay scale, which was substantially higher than the lower pay scale, if you did a stint in isolated rural schools where they had problems with recruitment. So you had to, I think it was 2 years you had to do that before you could get onto the higher pay scale. Of course, as soon as they'd done their 2 years, they bailed out into the cities where there was more going on and better communications. I don't think it applies now. I think they ditched it. The return of grammar schools will be socially divisive, as it always was, and it will do absolutely nothing to improve education for all. For the vast majority of pupils, it will only make things decidedly worse. It's just a smokescreen to divert attention from the real problems in education, especially up here in the north of England. I don't think it's been thought through at all, this whole business of the return of grammar schools. And it will end up a complete dog's breakfast. There's a group looking at all these questions about teacher recruitment and how the problem can be overcome. Particularly by bringing in teachers from the rest of the world. They're due to report on the 30th of November this year, 2016, so it'll be very interesting to see what they have to say. Anyway, there we are. My thoughts. Cheerio.